Hello and welcome to the Imprint Weekly Podcast. I'm John Kelley, Senior Editor of the Imprint, a daily news site covering child welfare and youth justice around the country. You can read all of our coverage at imprintnews.org or check us out on Facebook or Twitter at the Imprint News. You can also sign up on our homepage for our free weekly and monthly newsletters. And for professionals in child welfare and youth justice, subscribe to our Youth Services Insider section for a closer look at news on business policy and practice. The Imprint Weekly Podcast is also a member of the SafeCamp Audio Network. Check out our show page and all of SafeCamp's other great podcasts at safecampaudio.org on the web or at SafeCamp Audio on all social media. As we do each December on the podcast, we are going to end the year with a little best of edition. So there's nothing new here. If you have already listened to every single episode of the Imprint Weekly Podcast, congratulations. You may not need this one. I just picked clips from 12 of our best interviews from this year. So it's a good opportunity to kind of catch up on some of the best conversations we had. So I'm going to go through them one at a time, just kind of set up the clips for you guys, going in chronological order. So we'll start with the earliest from the year and run until just a couple of weeks ago. And Michael Fitzgerald on our Imprint team interviewed Alex Adams, who was leading child welfare policy for the Trump administration. Before we get to the 12 clips I have picked out, this is my last chance to remind all of you that we are in Newsmatch season. The Imprint is participating in the National Newsmatch campaign all the way to the end of December, which means that every dollar you donate to us by the end of this year will be doubled. Your support fuels powerful investigative reporting, lifts up voices that are too often unheard, and helps hold the powerful accountable while giving communities the coverage that they deserve. I just realized it's the first time I've read that a couple times throughout the month. I just kind of realized it rhymes. It's almost like a poem. Give today, make your impact go twice as far in supporting journalism that makes a difference. You can do that at imprintnews.org/donate. One more time for that, imprintnews.org/donate. All right, let's get into it. We're going to start with a clip from episode 192, which featured Liz Ryan, who at the time was just finishing up her tenure as the administrator for the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention, which she did for the Biden administration. So we had a chance to talk to Liz right after she had wrapped up something that really became a passion project for her during her time there at OJJDP, and that was the convening of, I think, the first National Youth Justice Conference really since 2011. That's the last time I remember going to one. So in talking to Liz, both about her tenure there and what they accomplished and what she was thinking about, what was on her mind, because this conference, I should mention, did happen after Election Day. So we knew that what the outcome of the election was. She knew that she'd be wrapping up her tenure and would not be continuing on in a new Harris administration in any way. What I asked her was just sort of how she was feeling about the moment. She was coming off this conference. There had been some state legislative changes that sort of rolled back some, more progressive reforms of juvenile justice that she had been one of the key people advocating for even before she had joined OJJDP. So here you're going to hear former OJJDP administrator Liz Ryan sort of talking about the moment we're in with youth justice.
I see it as an inflection point because, 50 years is a big milestone. And it's an opportunity for us to look back at what we've done, what we've accomplished, but it's also an opportunity for us to look forward. And that's why our conference was really focused on shaping the next 50 years of youth justice and thinking forward. And so for me, I have boundless optimism because I think we came into this conference and just were really uplifted by all the messages of hope and messages of collaboration and partnership. And really, we're in this together. No matter what happens going forward in the future, we're all committed to our young people. And we know there are some jurisdictions that have looked at media reports or data and are concerned about some increases in youth arrests over a 1-year period. I call that a fluctuation. It's not a trend. And that's not an excuse to to step back on what we've done on youth justice reform. To me, it's a call to action about doubling down on what works. So I'm optimistic about the future. And I just seeing all those young people today and throughout the conference talk about, their dreams, their aspirations. And I feel that it's our job to really support them in achieving that. And so that's where I'm focused. Look, I know that I'm only here till January 20th, and, I can't predict the future. But what I do know is that the field is united in a commitment to young people, and that this conference was an opportunity to both provide the practical tools and resources and connections on, all of the, I think, most innovative and creative programming around the continuum of care, prevention, intervention, reentry, but also as an opportunity to really inspire people.
Right. Our next clip comes from episode 195 of the Imprint Weekly Podcast. And this is not one that I did. This was my colleague, Nancy Marie Spears, who is our Indigenous Children and Families reporter for the Imprint, who did a really great sort of roundtable with a bunch of different guests on the future of the Indian Child Welfare Act. Now, a lot of people who listen to this podcast closely know that we did quite a bit of work investigating sort of the ins and outs of the Indian Child Welfare Act, which is better known as ICWA, and really closely followed the challenge to ICWA that had made its way through the court system up into the Supreme Court in the form of a case just frequently shorthanded as the Brackeen case. So that Brackeen case was really a very strong affirmation that, ICWA is likely here to stay. It's going to continue to be the law of the land. And what I think that Nancy Marie did here in this conversation was sort of pivot from will ICWA exist into what is the future of ICWA? What should it look like? What are we doing well under ICWA? How is ICWA serving states? What could it be doing better? How could states be implementing it better? All of that. There are a bunch of great interviews and conversations within this episode, so I strongly recommend you go back and listen to it if you haven't already. I just picked out this one. This is Linda Spears, who ran Massachusetts child welfare system at one point, now leads the Child Welfare League of America, and she is discussing here with Nancy Marie what state tribal collaboration on ICWA really should look like based on her experience, both leading a state agency and as a kind of person in a position of power with a national organization.
So, Linda, for non-native groups or maybe state-based groups who seek to increase ICWA compliance and strengthen tribal sovereignty more broadly, how do you advise that they begin that journey? And how important do you think that it is to have that buy-in from non-tribal or state-based groups?
I think it's really important. I think it comes from a willingness and openness to have dialogue, which means building relationships of trust with tribes, right? And I think that takes more than a minute. Tribes have a long history of not being sure whether they can trust. And therefore, we should not believe in communities that this happens simply by our choice to have it happen. It happens by putting in the time, effort, and energy. I once said to a colleague many years ago, who was doing some work with a tribe and met with a group in a state to be named later and tribes to be left unnamed, but really was met with a response of skepticism, doubt, and said, why are you coming in here thinking that you, because you're caring, are committed, that is sufficient for you to understand? I think responsiveness to that really has to do with a position of humility and understanding that the lessons to be learned to come into compliance with tribes are not simply reading the law and becoming expert at the law, right? It is understanding the culture, the community, and the position that tribes come and hearing the tribe tell you, right? Hearing members of that tribe tell you who they are, tell you what they stand for, tell you how they wish to work, and honoring that and working through it. Doesn't mean everybody agrees every day on everything, but it does mean that there is a tremendous, deeply held value and mutual respect, and that's to be part of the conversation. So first off is how we approach that work. We cannot approach it saying, I got 20 ideas about how to fix Indian child welfare. It really comes from, what do you want to do with your children? What do you as a tribal community want us to do to help you do that with your children, to support that and ensure that we're doing our part as non-tribal entities that are out there?
Okay, next clip comes from episode 199 of the podcast, which featured my conversation with Kelley Fong, who is a researcher and professor out of the University of California, Irvine, who wrote a terrific book called Investigating Families. And that book really was built in part on some research she did while embedded with the Connecticut Department of Children and Families for a time, and also some really extensive research and interviewing around a few other child welfare systems in the New England area. So the clip that you're going to hear is part of our conversation where Professor Fong was sort of reflecting back on what surprised her about, the back and forth between mandated reporters and the child protection system, sort of what she was surprised as the perception of the reports by the reporters, and the same thing kind of going the other way from the CPS workers, like how they reacted and responded to some of the things that they heard reported. So this is a really great conversation as well. I really recommend the book and the conversation. We were lucky enough to feature some of Professor Fong's work, in op-ed form. She wrote us some pretty good essays, particularly the one that stands out to me is the one that she wrote about her time embedded with the Connecticut system. So here is that clip from episode 199.
I thought there would be substantial disagreement in the way that these different parties understood the situations that families were facing. So between the parents, the reporting professionals, and the caseworkers. I thought that parents would articulate, an understanding of the situation that was rooted in sort of their social conditions, right? Poverty, domestic violence, addiction, and so on. And that the social workers and mandated reporters would be very quick to blame the parent and sort of call them, sort of bad, quote unquote, bad parents. And certainly we see some of that, and absolutely, especially once cases move past that investigation stage. So what I'm saying is really focused on the investigation stage here. But I actually found a lot more kind of concordance on this than I anticipated. So I was surprised to hear that, mandated reporters didn't think that kids needed to be removed. And I was surprised to hear that caseworkers would get these reports from reporters and say, like, why did this come to us? This shouldn't be something that we're involved with. Why are we getting all of these BS cases where the reporter could have just asked one more question and saved the family all this grief and saved us all of this work of, because for every single case, they're going out every other week. They're doing all of this document review. It's a whole lot of work that comes up. And so it struck me as an opportunity, I think, to leverage that kind of understanding that CPS might be involved in many more families than those that, folks think have serious safety concerns, and a real opportunity to kind of think about how to walk those back and get those families potentially routed, to more explicitly supportive supports.
Okay, rolling along in the best of the Imprint Weekly Podcast 2025. This is from an interview in episode 201 that we did with Amy Harfeld of the Children's Advocacy Institute on the appropriate use of Social Security benefits for youth who are in foster care. Now, this is a topic that has come back to the forefront because Alex Adams, who you're going to hear from in another clip a little bit later on in this review of our year, has made clear that at least when it comes to foster youth who are earning Social Security benefits because one of their parents or both of their parents died, they plan to pretty much go on offense against any states that are doing that. So they've already sent out letters kind of notifying states who enable that process of their position on it. In this clip, you're going to hear Ms. Harfeld. Well, first, you're going to hear me sort of posit to her my understanding based on my conversations with her and other experts and consuming all of the reporting that our team at the Imprint has done and other great outlets like NPR and Marshall Project, sort of what is supposed to happen when child welfare systems are essentially the payee on these benefits, which can come in the form of survivor benefits, like I just mentioned, or because of disabilities, either for the child or for the parents. So you're going to hear me sort of say, let me get this straight. Is this sort of my understanding this right, that this is what's supposed to happen? And then Amy does a good job sort of building off of that. So here is the clip from my interview with her. If I could try to sum that up in layman's terms and check me if I miss anything here, setting aside whether or not the child welfare agency would be the appropriate recipient anyway, to the extent they are, the expectation really should be that if they're getting money for an individual child because of their disability or because of something that happened with their parents, that money either should really be saved for them or it should be spent on them in a way that is very specific to something they need, not just for paying for the cost of them being in foster care. Is that about right?
That's about right. The fact of whether the child is eligible for or receiving benefits has nothing to do with how their foster care gets paid.
Right.
If a child is eligible for survivor or disability benefits, what it means is that in relative terms to the other kids in care, they are facing additional obstacles and barriers that will impact them long term in terms of their outcomes and their futures. So, would we like, ideally, for all kids in care to have money set aside for them, to have sort of a universal account that's available to all youth who age out? Yeah, of course. That's where I hope things go one day. Right now, there are a small group of foster youth who are facing these additional challenges and are eligible for these benefits. Those benefits are meant for them. And the word benefit really is all we need to know, right? A benefit is intended to be used to serve the interests, the individual best interests of that particular child. And you should be able to point to what is it that they got that was extra, right? How did they benefit from their benefits? And in the instance where a child's entire check is sucked up and spit out into a general state account, in the words of Ian Marks, who's a former foster youth from Louisiana, who's written and helped with a variety of different trainings, he said, I didn't get any better foster care than my foster care peers because I was receiving benefits. I got the same lousy foster care that they got. The only difference was I was the sucker who got stuck with the bill.
Our next clip comes from episode 202 of the Imprint Weekly Podcast, and this is a conversation with Dr. Sacha Klein of the Michigan State University School of Social Work. And I had Dr. Klein on. She's been on a few times. In this case, we were talking about Head Start because this was at a time, I believe we recorded this in the winter of 2025, where there started to be some indications early on in this Trump term that Head Start was a bit in the crosshairs. If I remember this right, there was sort of an early draft of a budget proposal out of HHS that would have either really cut back entirely on Head Start or dramatically cut it. And so that didn't end up happening. Actually, Head Start is fully funded in the White House's budget proposal for this year. And so that didn't really come to fruition. But I did have Dr. Klein on both to talk about Head Start's nexus with the child welfare system and really how it plays into the blocks of our childcare infrastructure. So, you can go to the interview to hear all of that. In this clip, you're going to hear Dr. Klein talk about her research on Head Start and her, relatively small scale research, which I know that she hopes to expand on one day, what that research says about what Head Start's impact can be on child welfare involvement.
So it was not an experimentally designed study, but we used a nationally representative sample of families in the child welfare system, both those in foster care and those who were supervised by the child welfare system but staying at home, and looked at sort of outcomes for those who had access to different kinds of early care and education services. We focused on the families with kids 0 to 5 years old. And what we found is specifically for families in the child welfare system who got Head Start services. So, and we did not find this for other kinds of early care and education, but just for Head Start services, they were 93% less likely to end up with their child being put in foster care, which has huge implications in terms of, keeping families together, in terms of just the human suffering element of not avoiding getting even more deeply mired in the child welfare system. But just at a kind of very pragmatic level, foster care is extraordinarily expensive to taxpayers. And so if we are eliminating a program that has, and there's evidence in other ways too, not just with respect to foster care, that Head Start actually saves taxpayers' dollars over time, it's potentially very short-sighted in terms of the economic health and well-being of the country.
Our next clip comes from episode 205 of the podcast, in which I interviewed Alex Briscoe, who has run all kinds of systems in Alameda County, which is Oakland for you non-Californians. He's run the mental health system there, the child welfare system to some extent as well. He knows mental health services, Medicaid in and out more than probably anybody I think I've ever interviewed. And he had just been recently come off a stint where he was helping to lead this California Children's Trust that had worked on developing a Medicaid waiver aimed at really rethinking how California delivered mental health services to kids in the state, particularly low-income children who were eligible for Medicaid. So a lot of great points in this conversation. It was a nice long one. This clip that I decided to include here was sort of a table-setting one, sort of at the beginning of our conversation before we got into the nitty-gritty of things like Medicaid. I just asked simply for Alex to step back, forget about all that for a minute, and just describe his view of how child mental health should flow in America from birth into adulthood. And he really did a great job of sort of taking the ball and running with it on that question. So here is Alex Briscoe.
Social and emotional support would be woven into the lives and experience of children and families where they live, work, and play. And the current medical model constraints that define the existing practice of mental health would be a very small component separated out. And what this looks like in practice is from conception through delivery and early childhood development, caregivers would receive support from the clinical community that they interact with on the physical health side, but also from a community of people with lived experience who would guide their social and emotional health and support their social and emotional health in what I would call social model programs. So what this might mean is from the minute you get pregnant and decide to procreate, someone is asking you how you're feeling, what's working for you and what's not working. And it's not necessarily a clinician, it's someone who shares your lived experience. That person is articulated to clinical supports, but your experience is intermediated by someone with traditional clinical training. And then as you go through the process of procreating and making a baby, you would find care and connection from people with relevant lived experience at every step of your journey. And then once your baby's born, when you take them to the doctor, you would get support from, again, people who might look like you or share your lived experience, who are connected to clinical supports if in the relatively limited need you might have in that way, you can get it. And then once your kid is going to school or going to a community center or playing on their playground, those spaces would be infused with supportive social and emotional content that celebrates and honors your experience and lets you feel seen. And then as you age into school age and early adolescence, you would be taught how to resist the toxic messages of this culture. You would be encouraged to find purpose and connection. You would be taught the skills of relationship. And then as you became an adolescent, you would get a chance to explore your purpose in the context of folks supporting you, again, who have relevant lived experience and connected to clinical supports if you needed it. And then by the time you were a high schooler or in college, you'd be thinking about the ways that you could support other people's growth and development and social emotional support. And it wouldn't be something that you would do as a professional or career. It would be part of the air we breathe as a culture. That we're mutually accountable for the context that we live in.
Okay, for our next clip, we're going to stay in California for this one. This is from episode 208. And it is a conversation that I had with Victor Dominguez, who is the CEO of the YMCA of Los Angeles, and Brandon Nichols, who directs the Los Angeles Department of Children and Family Services. What we were talking about was at the time, a recent announcement that the YMCA was going to provide a membership for every older foster youth in Los Angeles County. That was for free, completely covered by the YMCA, and included, of course, the gym membership, access to that, and all their recreational stuff, as well as all the community supports that kind of flow through the YMCA. I'm a big Y guy, just personal bias in this. I definitely was a member of the YMCA in DC while I lived there. I live in Detroit now. I go to the downtown Y here, which is my personal opinion is the best one I've ever been to. So who you're going to hear in this clip is Brandon Nichols, who runs DCFS in Los Angeles, really talking about, how rare it is for something like this to fall into his lap. He's basically talking about how proactive you usually have to be as a child welfare director to find, access to things for the kids in your system. And it was, in his mind, kind of refreshing for it to go the other way. I just love this story because it's one of those things where you hear about it and it just gets into your head like, why is this not pro forma the case all over the country? Why isn't every youth in foster care eligible for a YMCA membership? Let's make that happen. Whoever's got the money to do it. So here's our clip from that interview with Brandon Nichols.
I spend most of my days out there trying to put together partnerships to help families and kids. That's the truth. DCFS, our agency, can't do it alone. We need community and we need agencies to help us, help our kids, help our families. Those are not easy deals to make. This is a complicated system. The issues we deal with are emotional and also complex. I feel like I'm often pushing a boulder up a hill trying to put a program together to support kids. It was nothing like that with the YMCA. They contacted us and said, we want to help. And it was the easiest partnership I've ever worked on, maybe. I mean, really, I can't believe the speed that they moved. I can't believe the willingness they had to hear our asks. I can't believe the creativity they came to the table with. They were often saying, can we do more? Can we do more? Which really isn't what I hear all the time, to be honest. I'm always often in the position of asking folks, please, can you do more? Please, can you do more?
I was gonna say, how often are you getting asked as opposed to asking?
Exactly. Yeah, I feel like I knock on a lot of doors. I maybe like a car salesman. I'm trying to pitch a deal or get someone to come on board with me. This was just the opposite, and I will say that is a very unusual experience.
Okay, our next clip comes from episode 210 of the podcast. So this is a conversation that I had with Darla Bardine of the National Network for Youth, which advocates for runaway and homeless youth and the providers that work with them on the streets and shelters and all that. And then Barissa Ford of Youth in Need, which is a provider in St. Louis, Missouri. So we were talking just, I believe, days after the Trump administration finally put out the sort of grant competition guidelines for a lot of the funding that goes to these programs in the runaway and homeless youth space. And there wasn't a lot of time left, and they had changed the rules quite a bit, including getting rid of the street outreach component as its own sort of designated lane in runaway and homeless youth services. What I'm talking about here with Barissa Ford in the clip you're about to hear is what street outreach is like. And I just want to be clear, the grant competition did not get rid of street outreach. It just forced people who wanted to provide shelter services of various kinds to fold street outreach in, as opposed to giving grants to organizations like Barissa's who, have a specialty in actually conducting street outreach services and have people like her who really focus on that. So in this clip, you're going to hear Barissa Ford talking about sort of the nature of that work, what it's like to be out there trying to engage a young person on the street and how that all goes. So here is a clip from that interview. If you only have 10 seconds, what is that?
You only have 10 seconds. Yeah. I think being calm, because, of course, when someone's in crisis, the last thing you want to do is be raspy. Right. Yeah. So always approaching something in a very calm way. you want to find information, but you don't want to ask too many questions to the point it feels like you're interrogating a young person. You want to make them comfortable. You know, we all want to feel respected. We all want to feel cared for. We all want to feel like we can trust the person we're talking to. So I think it's just coming in, being very genuine, not overpromising anything, explaining what your role is, who you are to that young person, because unfortunately, a lot of the young people that we do experience have had not the best interactions with adults, the adults in their lives that were supposed to be there to teach them things, to care for them, to protect them. A lot of times we're not able to for various reasons that, you know, that we may or may not get into. But so be understanding that, being very trauma informed, walking into the situation and knowing that, you know, some youth might tell you their whole life story in 10 seconds and some youth are very hesitant.
Next up, we have a clip from episode 214 of the podcast. This is journalist and author Claudia Rowe, who wrote Wards of the State last year. It's a tremendous book. It follows really the lives of several young people who have experienced both the child welfare system and or the youth justice system. It really keys in on one young woman from Washington, but there's all kinds of stories in this book. I really highly recommend it. Now, Claudia and I, in the clip you're going to hear, are actually not talking about that book. This clip that I selected came before we really got into it. And I just really like it because Claudia here is talking about the current media attention to child welfare and youth justice. And the reason that she's in a position to do that as well as anybody in this country is because there's really not a whole bunch of veteran journalists like her who have kept these issues in focus their entire careers. Our executive editor at the Imprint, Karen DeSaw, is definitely one of them. Carol Marbin Miller in Florida. I'm definitely missing a few, and there's certainly some younger journalists coming up who are really focused in on these issues, but Claudia is in that group. She started out in New York covering these issues and then moved to Washington and covered them there. So she's talking here sort of about what she observes to be the difference about the way that child welfare and youth justice are covered now versus at different points in her career. You are in rarefied air to me as one of these reporters who has been focused on these systems for so long. It's not a lot of you. Karen DeSaw on our staff obviously is, you know, one of the greatest. You're 1 in 1A, but there's not that many. So, you know, I guess my question to you is going to be, in those decades that you've been working on this, do you feel like the journalism of child welfare and juvenile justice has changed? Do you think we're any different than we were when you were starting?
I really appreciate this question because it is a bee in my bonnet. It is something I have raised a lot. I think both things are happening. I think journalism about child welfare has changed a lot since I began really looking at that area in any kind of depth. I think that with the advent of outlets like ProPublica, of course, the Imprint, to some extent, I would also put the Marshall Project in there and Mother Jones. Those outlets and you guys are focusing readers on, I think, the big picture issues, really sort of systemic problems, thematic threads that are concerning about child welfare. That's a huge boon and a big change. On the other side, though, with the kind of contraction in local daily journalism, local newspapers, I see sort of regular beat reporting dropping off. And it really has troubled me. You know, this is certainly true in Washington State. We had 2 major newspapers in Seattle, as well as many other newspapers around the state. Those 2 major newspapers in Seattle both made foster care and child welfare more broadly a beat. Those were beat reporters who were scrutinizing those agencies every single day. Now we only have 1 major newspaper in Seattle, and that newspaper does not cover child welfare as a beat. The Seattle Times has sort of ceded that coverage to breaking news and general assignment reporters. And you can see the difference. And I think the agency, the state Department of Children, Youth, and Families, understands that there isn't that level of scrutiny on everything they do. And, you know, I would argue that changes practice.
All right, rolling along here in the best of the Imprint Weekly Podcast 2025, as my dog Dracula has taken to chewing a very noisy bone next to me to get my attention. I apologize if you hear that. This is also a clip from an interview with an author. This is with Gretchen Sisson, who is a sociologist studying abortion and adoption. Her research on mothers who choose to relinquish their rights into private adoptions led her to writing a book called Relinquished: The Politics of Adoption and the Privilege of American Motherhood. And in this clip you're going to hear now, Gretchen is talking to me about what her research for the book and before it suggests about the life changes that prompt a woman's decision to put a child up for adoption.
Almost all of the women that I interviewed continued their pregnancies with the intention of raising their child. And that's why I don't always say that these were like crisis pregnancies or unwanted pregnancies, because a lot of times they were very happy to be pregnant, but they faced a crisis later in their pregnancy, late, third trimester at or after 20 weeks. It usually is the idea that they couldn't come out of. So maybe a partner left them, so they lost that form of support. Maybe they were living with their parents or a roommate, they got kicked out. Maybe they were facing houselessness or whatever, they lost a job, something that introduced a level of instability that they could not find their way out of before the baby was born. And that level of vulnerability is what led to the adoptions in the first place. And that's why I think that this is not as separate from the child welfare system as historically it was, because historically it was very different. And I think that both of those institutions, those forces are increasingly converging, where we view family separation through child welfare and foster care and public adoption and through private adoption as a way of addressing a need, as a way of, purportedly caring for children, rather than creating any kind of social safety net that would allow parents to care for their children the way that they want to.
Home stretch here. We got two more for you. This clip comes from episode 218, which is the back end of a two-parter we did with Vinny Schiraldi. Now, Vinny has been around youth justice for a long time, studied at the feet, so to speak, of Jerry Miller, who's a very renowned progressive reformer in the space, helped get the Center on Juvenile and Criminal Justice off the ground, helped launch the Justice Policy Institute, and then became a system leader himself. He ran the DC juvenile justice system. He's run the Maryland juvenile justice system. In between that, he led probation for everybody in New York City, also had a stint running Rikers Island there in New York City. So Vinny graciously agreed to do sort of a career spanning interview to talk about all of this stuff and sort of reflect back on all the stops that he's made and answer some kind of big existential questions for me as well. In the clip that I'm going to play for you here, he is talking about the way that the narrative and the issues are kind of shaped and framed within the youth justice conversation. And in particular, he's talking here about the limits of data as a forward strategy in communicating about justice reform.
It's helpful to have good talking points, but I think if you look at the way the right wing handles this when they want to lock more people up, they very much focus on idiosyncratic emotional stories. And I think one of the things that our side of this, the side of this argument that doesn't want to lock a lot of kids up, is we lead with data in a way that I don't think ever was all that persuasive to the general public, and is especially less persuasive now that, the Trump administration and so many on the right have called the validity of data into question. I mean, we were killing people during the pandemic because we didn't believe the data around it. If we were willing to expose grandma to a life-threatening disease because we didn't trust science, I'm pretty sure we're going to be willing to lock more Black kids up because we don't trust science. So we need to, I think, pivot. I think the data is important. It's very clear that locking kids up with adults worsens their outcomes. It's very clear that Maryland is a leader in this field. We put more kids in adult prison per capita than every state in the country. except Alabama. 6% of the people in our prisons entered when they were juveniles. That's true for 3% of the prisons nationally. And 91% of those young people are young people of color. Those are all really important statistics. They matter. If some kid is involved in a terrible crime tonight that gets caught on somebody's door cam and is on the head of the evening news, we should be very careful about how we respond to that and not just use data and let ourselves emote as real human beings as well.
Okay, this is the last clip I have for you in the Best of Imprint Weekly Podcast 2025. It comes from an episode we aired just a couple of weeks ago, episode 224, in which my colleague, Imprint reporter Michael Fitzgerald, interviewed Alex Adams, who is the Assistant Secretary for Family Support at the Administration for Children and Families, which basically makes him the top child welfare official in the Trump administration. Now, this was a wide-ranging interview. It was like 80 minutes long. So I definitely think if you are interested in child welfare and kind of want to hear about what the indications are as far as what the Trump administration is going to be interested in, listen to the entire conversation. It was a really good one. Michael did a really great job, engaging Mr. Adams on a range of topics in child welfare. The reason that I chose the clip you're about to hear is because Mr. Adams has set out a home for every child as sort of the North Star goal for child welfare during this second Trump term. And if you listen to this clip, you really are gaining an insight into how Mr. Adams, who was a budget director first before becoming a child welfare director in Idaho, really sort of teed up both sides of that, both the best outcomes within child welfare and the budgetary needs of government to sort of craft that exact same goal in his state. So a home for every child is now a federal goal. It was his goal in Idaho beforehand. So this is sort of like an origin story if you listen to the clip.
Going back to basics, we're able to isolate the three budget variables. How many kids come through the front door is your most important driver. If you can keep a kid in their home and provide services or broker services for them and keep that family together, you will have better outcomes for the child and you avoid the trauma of removal. In Idaho, I was paying $1.80 per day for in-home prevention cases. I build out my prevention team to prevent kids coming into care. Prevention should be the goal, but it's not possible in all cases. We can't take the eye off the ball that there are some cases that will necessarily come into foster care, abuse cases, sexual abuse, physical abuse. When they come into foster care, their second budget driver is where you place them. Kinship care is generally your lowest cost, often tied with non-relative care. In Idaho, I was paying $16 a day for each. If I did not have a home available for them and they had to come into congregate care, I was paying on average $385 per day in congregate care. That's the average. There was a wide range. In some cases, we were paying $1,200 a day for out-of-state complex care because it's a seller's market. That rate kept creeping up. And as a state agency head, I had no choice but to say, where do I sign? Your third budget driver is how long they're in care. If you can reunify them, or if there's a timelier path to permanency, you have better outcomes with a permanent plan and lower cost because of reduced length of stay. So, we basically isolated three budget drivers: front door, placement setting, length of stay. And then we talked about as a leadership team, if we were going to set one goal, what would that be? Because we had a lot of people coming to us sincerely saying, you should focus on kinship, you should focus on prevention, you should focus on ombudsman, you should focus on all these things. The center of the square was always the best interest of the child, but the outer rings were very divergent. So we as a leadership team said, what we want to do is we want to increase our ratio of homes to children. And looking at it as a ratio gave us the ability to make progress on both sides of that equation. You can get your ratio up by focusing on your numerator. Your numerator is your number of homes. So you can get your homes up through retention, through faith-based partnerships, through recruitment campaigns, streamline kin licensure, making it as easy as possible to get kin through the door. More importantly, you can get your denominator down by preventing kids coming in. having credible alternatives that preserve families, keep them together, provide services for the root causes of kids coming into care. You can get your denominator down through legal advocacy for children. You can get your denominator down through how you deploy predictive analytics and other things like that.
All right, that's officially a wrap for the Imprint Weekly Podcast in 2025. Thanks to all of our guests for coming on to discuss the important issues of the day in child welfare and youth justice and youth homelessness and anything else we asked them about, and for also humoring me when we make them give us pop culture favorites to start every episode. Thanks to our great reporters at the Imprint, our editors, for always giving me a ton to talk about on our headlines editions of the podcast. And of course, to the wizard herself, Christine Onjoko, for always making me and the guests sound good. I'd like to thank Dracula, my dog, and partner in crime here at our Detroit office for not making too much noise while we recorded these. And of course, most of all, thank you guys all for listening to the Imprint Weekly Podcast. The Imprint Weekly Podcast is a production of the Safe Camp Audio Network, which is a division of Fostering Media Connections. Please visit safecampaudio.org on the web or at Safe Camp Audio on all major social media. This podcast is produced and mixed by Christine Onjoko with music by Luke Giroux and Cyrus Elia. If you enjoyed this episode, we'd love it if you would consider subscribing or giving us a 5-star rating on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you download your podcasts. And we would greatly appreciate if you would consider supporting our work here on the podcast and in print. Small donations from our listeners and readers go a long way towards helping us grow and cover more great stories in child welfare and youth justice. To support us, it is very easy. Just visit imprintnews.org/donate. And if you are listening to this before the clock strikes midnight on December 31st, you get that donation in, it's going to be doubled. imprintnews.org/donate. You can follow The Imprint on Twitter and Facebook by searching the handle @TheImprintNews and visit us on the web at imprintnews.org. You can always get us over email at tips@imprintnews.org. I'm John Kelley. Happy New Year, and we'll see you in 2026.